Welcome to this month's Becoming Bohemian Book Club. Tonight we will be discussing A Girl of the Limberlost by James Stratton Porter. And I'm so excited to get into this book. Before we do though, I just have to take one quick sip of tea. Many of you may already know, if you've been following me on Instagram, I am a tea lover, and I think I've mentioned tea in a few of my videos. The tea that I'm drinking tonight is a candy cane green tea by Trader Joe's. It's wonderful. I highly recommend it. And I also wanted to mention that I had the fortune to speak this afternoon with a few butterfly experts, one of which, Paul Bourbin, was incredibly helpful in answering my questions about moths and butterflies. And so we'll be discussing the interview that I had with him tonight. So that's just a little preview of coming attractions for this evening. So, Girl of the Limberlost. As starting out, I just have to say I love how James Stratton Porter structures her books. It kind of reminded me of watching a series of Friends. Marta Kaufman is one of the writers of Friends, and it definitely reminded me each chapter is sort of similar to a Friends episode, you know, the one where Joey gets the soap opera role of his dreams, you know, for instance. That's kind of the way Friends is structured, and Girl of the Limberlost is very similar. I love how the chapters give us a little bit of a, you know, preview of coming attractions into what's going to be discussed in the book. So for instance, you know, chapter 1, wherein Eleonora goes to high school and learns many lessons not found in her books. So they're all kind of these cool clues about what's to come in the book, and I think that's just really fun. I also loved at the beginning of the book the character description. I'm not sure if you can see this with the lighting the way it is in this room, but she just does a really sweet job of summing up each character before you get into the book. Eleonora, who collects moths to pay for her education and lives the golden rule. Philip Ammon, who assists in moth hunting and gains a new conception of love. Mrs. Comstock, who lost a delusion and found a treasure. Wesley Simpton, who always did his best. Margaret Simpton, who mothers Eleonora. Billy, a boy from real life. Edith Carr, who discovers herself. Hart Henderson, to whom love means all things. Polly Ammon, who pays an old score. Tom Levering, engaged to Polly. Terence O'More, freckles grown tall. Mrs. O'More, who remained the angel. Terence, Alice, and little brother, the O'More children. So I just love James Stratton Porter's descriptions, the way she writes. You can tell she loves her characters, and that love that's infused into her writing and description of each character really gets transmitted to us. I think it's really hard to not fall in love with the characters in the book. James Stratton Porter herself was a naturalist, and she was a self-taught naturalist. I think you see a lot of her in several characters in the book. I think you see her in Eleonora. I think you also see her in the Bird Woman. She was a prolific writer, and she, in addition to A Girl of the Limberlost, wrote Freckles, which preceded this book, and in many ways is kind of a prequel to Girl of the Limberlost. This is sort of the second book in that little two-part series. And then she also wrote a very natural book about the moths of the Limberlost, which is really a fascinating photographic, illustrated book and scientific work that documents those moths that she discusses here in this book. I have to say, I selected this book somewhat selfishly for this month. I knew it was, you know, it's our only YA novel, technically a YA novel, that we are reading this year. And I wanted to go back to my past, to one of the books that was truly formative in my adolescence and growing up. And I wanted to reread it through with my adults, through my adult lens, through my eyes now, and just see not only how much I've kind of grown through these characters, but also kind of get a glimpse back into my own history growing up. I was really fortunate. My mom was this big proponent of nature notebooks. And so when we were young, we would very carefully record the goings and comings of scrub jays in our backyard. We actually fed scrub jays off of like our bodies. And so we were laying down and having peanuts and things laying on like my leg, and the birds would actually come and hop onto us and eat the nuts and things. And we would go out and we dissected owl pellets growing up. That was something that I did, and we would document our findings of leaves and plants and caterpillar larvae and the chrysalises of butterflies and things. We collected and we documented, and I think one of the things as I was reading the book this month that struck me as I looked around me, in the city here in San Francisco, at the youth and young people, and also while I was in Southern California visiting some family there, just how absorbed we as a society are, and our young people in particular, are in technology. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but there are great things that come with technology. They're wonderful tools. But it does make me sad to think that there is not as much time spent outside, I feel, as young people grow up. And I really think that's a shame. If you are more interested in what has been termed nature deficit disorder, there is a wonderful book by Richard Louv, I believe is his last name, and it's called Last Child in the Woods. And he talks about nature deficit disorder and the impact, the lack of being out and surrounded by the beauties of the world, how that impacts us and how that has, created some problems perhaps in the development of our children. So I just was thinking back to my childhood and in reading this book and just reminiscing about all the wonderful time that I did spend outdoors growing up. I did not grow up near the Limberlost, however, and I am so jealous of Elnora for that. I love Elnora. She, I think, as far as female protagonists in books, if I were to have a girl crush on one, it probably would be Elnora. She is kind of everything with her keen intelligence and her desire to learn, her very scientific mind, her love of nature and love of other people too, just that real kind heart of gold that she has. I think she is just a lovely character, and someone that's really fun to get to know through the book. The one thing that I had forgotten reading this a second time was that Jean Stratton Porter, this is one thing I thought was a little bit unfortunate, is that Jean Stratton Porter, she introduces Elnora, and Elnora starts school in the first few chapters of the book, and we start to kind of see Elnora begin to make friends with her schoolmates. But then that abruptly, fast forwards through kind of the middle part of high school, and suddenly she's a senior and she's about to graduate. And I realize perhaps, Jean Stratton Porter was trying to keep things somewhat short and keep it focused more on the natural world of the Limberlost and maybe a little less on school and her kind of development through school. But I did kind of miss those stories that could have been found in her school days that I think are unfortunately absent in the book. That is one regret I have, and one, I guess, criticism I would have for Jean Stratton Porter, is that she kind of leaves a lot of that to our imaginations and kind of just brushes through it, and we are suddenly, into her senior year, and then she's meeting Philip Ammon and falling in love. So those were a couple of things that I guess, one thing in particular that kind of frustrated me, I guess, with the book. The other thing that was interesting that I had not remembered, that didn't necessarily frustrate me, but that I thought was interesting, was how she was very much moralistic, I guess, and at times maybe leaning on the side of a little bit preachy. In the book, I'm thinking particularly of the time when Elnora's mother, Kate Comstock, visits her father's, the woman that he'd had an affair with, the neighbor, and exposes her, and the woman has cancer and is dying, and she just lights into this woman and kind of acts as if like the cancer was this curse from God because of her infidelities, and I thought that was maybe quite a bit harsher than necessary personally, and just seemed a little bit like overly moralistic and perhaps a little bit reductive and simplistic when it comes to how she could have maybe treated her late husband with the same kind of contempt that she kind of lashes out and bestows all of that on his mistress. So that was, it was a little bit like, I don't know that we needed to kind of get overly preachy about things of that nature. Also, there was a lot of the, looks should be secondary to inner beauty, which is good, but there's just like you're kind of beaten over the head with certain things like that. And then the other thing that actually I wasn't so perhaps happy with for my own sort of, I don't know, sense of what's a good idea, what's a bad idea, is her kind of poo-pooing or putting down, I guess, college and university studies for Elnora, that the Limberlost was going to be the only teacher that she would ever really need, that school of experience. And while I can appreciate some of that, I do think that it would have been kind of fun to see Elnora go to university as well. I think that she would have really enjoyed, those science classes that she might have taken, and contributed a lot as well to her classmates' learning, by going to university, and I might have really enjoyed that learning environment. And so I wasn't fully on board with Philip Ammon when he says to her, he says, your mind does not need that sort of development, talking about college. Stick close to your work in the woods. You're becoming so infinitely greater on it than the best college girl I ever knew, that there is no comparison. When you have money to spend, take that violin and go to one of the world's great masters and let the Limberlost sing to him. If he thinks he can improve it very well, I have my doubts. Do you really mean it, that you would give up all idea of going to college in my place? I really mean it, said Philip. If I now held the money in my hands to send you and could give it to you in some way you would accept it, I would not. I do not know why it is the fate of the world always to want something different from what life gives them. If you could only realize it, my girl, you are in college and have been always. You're in the school of experience, and it has taught you to think and given you a heart. You've been in the college of the Limberlost all your life, and I never met a graduate from any other institution who would begin to compare with you in sanity, clarity, and interesting knowledge. I wouldn't even advise you to read too many books on your lines. You acquire your material firsthand, and you know that you are right. What you should do is to begin early to practice self-expression. Don't wait too long to tell us about the woods as you know them. And I guess Philip I have mixed feelings about as well, I guess. But I really kind of was a little bit, I really was disappointed with that portion of the book where he tends to sort of push against college and say that she's really learned all that she needs to, and not even worry too much about studying books or reading too much. she has all that she needs of book learning. And that I just found kind of disappointing, because I think that she truly would be benefit, from going to college. I feel like it would have been a really wonderful place for her. So that I thought was a little bit sad. But I can understand, I guess, conversely looking at it, she did learn so much, and she was so mature for a teenager to read through. She, her decision-making skills, her clarity of mind, her ability to sacrifice and for what she really wanted, and her patience was so admirable. And the knowledge that she had of the woods and the surroundings she was in was incredible. And so I think I do understand, it was a university that she was being taught in the Limberlost. And Jean Stratton Porter did not have formal education. She also quit college, actually, her senior year of high school, excuse me. She did not go on to university. So so perhaps she's kind of putting her thoughts and opinions into her writing here through Philip, saying, you have all the knowledge you need to go forward, and speaking to herself as kind of the young Elnora. And then it's interesting because in that passage, Elnora even asks Philip, follow the course of the bird woman, you mean? Because the bird woman, as we learn through the book, is self-taught as well, and had a very similar upbringing, it seems, to Elnora's. And their paths seem fates sort of draw them together often, and they intersect a lot throughout the book. And I don't think that's an accident. I think Jean Stratton Porter was sort of the bird woman, and she was the young Elnora. And so we sort of see, her voice really comes through in those characters. And the bird woman is a fascinating person, this early naturalist. This is early 1900s. This book was published, I believe, in 1909. I think Freckles was published in 1904. This is the early 1900s, and logging and exploiting natural resources for industrialization was very common at this time. You have the factory work beginning to take off at this time, and so we're burning coal, and we're chopping down a lot of trees for lumber to build America, to really build these houses, build the cities. And so these forests, the Limberlost forests, that is a huge part of it. You see through the book that the townspeople are selling their land, they're selling their lumber, they're selling the wood, they're chopping it down to sell, to live, to get by. And they're using those natural resources to get gain. And that is something where I see Jean Stratton Porter is a revolutionary figure in her conservationist sort of movement that she embraces, and kind of becomes this activist for naturalism and for conservationalism, and for, in particular, the conservation of the Limberlost in Indiana, because she lived there as well. And I think that is really interesting. Throughout the book, she puts a little bit of that in there, that, Kate Comstock will not sell the land and will not sell the lumber that could be produced on, taken down from her land and sold. She refuses to do that, partly because of the love of her dead husband. But you also get this sense that there's this green streak in her, and it's also in Elnora, that they want to preserve and conserve that land versus chopping it all down. And I love that. I love the passages that talk about the beauty of the Limberlost, and about that decision to keep it as pure and as tampered with as possible, and that even the swamps become beautiful in their own way and appreciated by Elnora and those around her. And I love Jean Stratton Porter for that she recognized the sad fate of the trees and of the natural resources around her and really wanted to preserve them. And incredibly, Jean's books were famous, and that is rare, I think, often in writing, that you are a self-taught writer. Your first books that you create become very well received, and she was not only very progressive in her naturalist ways and her conservationist ways and her scientific approach to nature and documenting it. She was also very revolutionary and progressive in her marriage. She maintained and she retained her maiden name. She hyphenated Stratton and then her married name Porter. She married a pharmacist, a chemist, I believe, who was, I think, about 20 years her senior, so a little bit older. They fell in love and married, but she had children and kind of kept the home. But she also was very restless, she says in her biography, and loved learning about nature and being out in nature. And so she started writing. She wrote the book Freckles and then wrote Girl of the Limberlost, and people loved them. She wrote for magazines as well. And then not only that, but she started a production studio. They moved to California for a time, and she started her own production studio. She was very much a self-starter and a go-getter. Rather than giving the rights to her books over to any particular production studio, she wanted to make them herself. And she was somewhat successful. I think she was more successful at writing than she was in the movie industry, in the films industry. But she was constantly trying to learn and grow and improve herself. And she was a photographer as well. And that's where I think it's fascinating to see the intersection between art and science. She used the medium of photography to capture the natural world around her. She was also a painter, and so she would paint and paint wonderful nature scenes as well. One of the earliest nature paintings, or painters, I should say, was Albertus Siva, and he created a book full of illustrative drawings of the natural world, botanical prints, as well as animal, not only plants, but animal, reptiles, mammals, eggs, of animals throughout Europe and the Americas. You can get a book, you can get his book on the Cabinet of Natural Curiosities on Amazon or wherever books are sold. You can check it out from the library as well. But it is beautiful to see the artistic depictions of butterflies and moths, some of them mentioned in Jean Stratton Porter's book, Girl of the Limberlost. They're just absolutely stunning. Show you some of them here. Absolutely beautiful. He documents the natural world, and so this was popular back in not only the 18th, mid to late 18th and 19th centuries when Albertus Siva was writing, but it was very popular in the 19th and early 20th centuries to have these cabinets of curiosities, natural world wonders that you would find on your travels and bring back to your living room to put in your cabinets. So when I spoke today to a few of the docents at the San Francisco Conservatory of Flowers, I asked them about this practice that we read about in The Girl of the Limberlost with the Bird Woman and with Elnora, collecting and preserving butterflies and documenting them and creating kind of these cabinets of curiosities And I was told very sternly that that is highly regulated now. Obviously, I think that's something, a conclusion we all can probably come to. As much as I am a huge Elnora fangirl, you cannot go out and just collect moths and sell them and trade them as they once were. In 2010, I was in Senegal doing some research there for some work I was doing after my studies at university, and there were street vendors who would sell these there were these artists that would sell these pictures, these beautiful sort of portraits that they would create with butterfly and moth wings. There were these sort of mosaic mixed media compositions that were absolutely beautiful, if not perhaps ethical. And that's kind of an interesting question I think I would like to just leave the community. It'd be interesting to hear what you think about the ethics of capturing and collecting butterflies and moths. You know, Elnora struggles with this, and I think you see kind of that naturalist in Jean Stratton Porter, you know, her voice come out with Elnora. She struggles with it when she is talking to the bird woman about the moths that she has and collecting moths. The bird woman asks her, "What have you collected?" And she says, Elnora responds, "I'm afraid I'm bothering you for nothing and imposing on you." She said, "That, quote, collected word frightens me. I've only gathered. I always loved everything outdoors, so I made friends and playmates of them. When I learned that the moths die so soon, I saved them, especially because there seemed no wickedness in it." So you can tell that Elnora struggles with that idea of kind of collecting nature to put on display, to sort of, you know, for sort of status anxiety purposes, I guess, to say, look, I have status, I've collected these brilliant moths, you know, and yet she does sell them for school in the book. And so she does end up doing just that. And she does use the word collection, or at least Philip and others around her use that word when they're talking about, you know, the yellow emperor moth, for instance, being the last to complete the collection to sell for her college. So I think it's interesting that you see that sort of ethical dilemma through the book, and I think that dilemma still exists today. I think butterflies are beautiful, and in fact, I asked on my Christmas wish list this year was these caterpillars, this larvae that you can actually kind of grow your own little butterfly garden, like a terrarium, and then set the butterflies free. That's kind of my goal. But you know, I know that there's a little bit of that temptation as I read this book, thinking, gosh, that would be wonderful to get to explore and collect butterflies, but it's not really ethical, and they're so needed in the ecosystem. And that brings me back to my discussion with Paul Bourbin, the docent at the Conservatory of Flowers at their Butterflies and Blooms exhibit. He was saying that there are, here in California alone, there are a couple of butterflies that are they're bordering extinction, and they're indigenous. They're just found in just two places. I think it was called the blue mooring butterfly. I'll double check on that. But it's just in one area, and I think San Bruno, he was saying, and then another area, I think closer to the Santa Clara area, that they're found that they're becoming more and more extinct, and that's just tragic. And so again, I think just want to discourage anyone in the club who, after reading this, was thinking collecting butterflies might be a really fun hobby. Maybe, you know, consider that choice carefully, and perhaps think again, just because of you know, the butterflies and their contribution to pollination, which is so necessary for our survival, the food that we eat. We owe a lot to butterflies for pollinating the fruit trees and the flowers, the flowering plants that provide nourishment to us. for the trees, for, you know, so much of the plant life that we enjoy, we owe in large measure to butterflies and our other pollinating insects that keep that going, and that regeneration and that cycle of life continuing. And so, you know, if they do become extinct, you know, that's going to pose huge problems for our ecosystem. So getting into, I know we've touched on my interview with Paul Bourbin from the San Francisco Conservatory of Flowers. They have a fantastic exhibit right now, and it's going on for about a week and a half, I think about 10 more days. It closes next weekend, I believe, the 7th of January, I believe it's going through. So so please go and see it. Make sure if you are in the Bay Area to see it, because it's really beautiful what they have, all the plants that attract butterflies and then the butterflies that they have there. And they have a case of chrysalises that are of butterflies that are actually being born there, so you can see them live. And if you're not in the Bay Area, you can check out my Insta stories. I did take some video while I was there. I did a live Insta story of the exhibit, and I did spend a little bit of time in that case when you first walk into the exhibit and see the butterflies being born. It's really special. It's such a neat experience to watch them break through the chrysalis and dry out their wings before they fly. So the questions that I asked Paul, I asked him because it seemed in the book that Elnora was often waiting for June, you know, or the summer months, that many of the moths that she prized came alive and were most active in kind of the June, July, summertime. And so I asked him, are the summer months when butterflies and moths are most active? And he said, no. I mean, he said, yes, there are some species that is the time that they are the most active, because that's when the plants are growing in certain regions. But that here in California, I mean, we can see them all year long. You can see them in January. You see them all year long. And then I asked him about sort of the place, because obviously in the Limberlost, it's very swampy, and, you know, it's humid. It's sort of jungle-like, I was imagining. And so I asked him, is that, you know, and they're in the Conservatory of Flowers, you know, it's warm, it's humid, they keep it intentionally that way. It's like a greenhouse conservatory. It's an old 1900s, beautiful Victorian structure, conservatory. And so I asked him, you know, do butterflies need that warmth to really thrive? And he said, not at all. That there are butterflies and moths that live in Arctic conditions. He mentioned the Arctic woolly bear moth that lives literally up in like Alaska and up as far north as like the North Pole, like very, very frigid conditions. And in Greenland, I think it's well known in Greenland. So that was fascinating to me. I didn't realize that in very cold winter-like conditions, moths and butterflies, there are certain species that do thrive. And then I asked a little bit about the life cycle of moths and butterflies. And so basically you start with the egg or larva, or the ovum, excuse me, and then it becomes kind of a larva or a caterpillar. And then they eat a lot. Paul mentioned that his wife had a particular tree that these caterpillars got to, and they thought, oh, we'll let them eat their fill. And within just a couple of days, they had completely weed whacked that little bush tree that was there. I mean, it was like gone, he said. So they eat a lot in preparation for their chrysalis, for their sort of pupa time, when they're in that tightly wrapped cocoon. So they eat a lot as caterpillars preparing for that sort of hibernation time when they'll be developing their wings. And then they go into that hibernation, and that time can vary. There are some moths, I think the gypsy moth is like 7 weeks or something, so it can be a while, and for some it's just a couple of weeks. I think that's pretty common, kind of like the week to 10 days to 2 week mark. And then they then they break free and become butterflies or moths, and they dry their wings, and then they live for anywhere from like 2 weeks to like 2 months, it seems, is just depending on the species again. So it's relatively short, just as Elnora mentions. They don't really live very long. And so then we talked a little bit about this particular plant and kind of the symbiotic relationship between plants and butterflies and caterpillars and moths, and how evolution has worked with both plant and moth and butterfly species to create these special relationships where moths are mostly nocturnal. As we read in the book, Girl at the Limberlost, you know, when Kate Comstock is feeling remorse and goes out, to try to find a pair of yellow emperors, she's going out at night, because that is when they are most active, is at night. And so because of this, when you think about the kinds of food that moths may enjoy, the kinds of plants, often they are white. And that is because it's when there are white plants, the moonlight reflects off of them and attracts the moths. The moths see them better at night. And then moths also use pheromones to track their plant and to get their food. So the scent that the flower emits is what attracts the moth to it. And then he mentioned, when I asked him about, that classic expression like moths to a flame or moths to light, why that is, that if they're nocturnal, why is it that when you turn on a light, or if you go outside and you have a porch lamp lit or light lit, that you'll see moths just flying around it? And he said that actually probably had something to do with sort of reproduction, and also being able to see, to sort of see wings and see fellow moths and things, that it was a little bit more that way, but that had a little bit more to do with that sort of watering hole sort of effect of them all congregating in one place, and they don't have night vision, and so the light is nice for them to be able to sort of see, suddenly they can see. But it was interesting, he talked about this particular orchid called the Darwin orchid. So way back when Darwin wrote The Origin of Species, so long time ago, I don't have the exact year off the top of my head, I want to say like 1892 or something like that, like the late 1800s is when the book was published, I believe. I could be wrong, could be very wrong. Someone correct me if I'm wrong. But he discovered, as part of the book, he writes about this orchid, the Darwin orchid, and it is a white orchid. And they have one there at the Conservatory of Flowers, you can see. And it was sort of a mystery as to how that orchid was pollinated and how it continued to exist. Like which moth, he projected in his book, The Origin of Species, he theorized that there was a particular moth that pollinated that plant, and that was how it grew and it flourished and it continued, was because a moth would pollinate it. It's a very difficult plant to pollinate. The way the flowers are arranged, it takes a moth with a very, very long tongue to go all the way down to where it needs to be in the plant to pollinate it. And so I think in like the 1920s or 1930s, Paul, the man I was talking to at the Conservatory of Flowers, the docent, he said that he thought it was probably some poor grad student, but they basically had someone, they sent him out to do research at night. And so he had to like spend the night out by one of these orchid plants to wait and watch to see, to document what it was that was pollinating this plant, that kept it going, that kept it surviving. And sure enough, Darwin was right. It was a moth. And let me see. I want to say there was a particular name for it that I wrote down. Let's see what it was. It was like I want to say xanthomoth. And it has like an incredibly long proboscis. But it was like a sphinx moth called, I believe, the xanthomoth. I'll make sure of that. But yeah, it was fascinating. He said there are very specific flowers that work with specific moths and specific butterflies to continue to regenerate themselves, that it's like this special partnership. And then he also said that, you know, there are moths and butterflies that will pollinate multiple plants, and that those are the ones that actually tend to survive the longest and not go extinct, are the ones that are not specialized but that are more generalized, because they're able to adapt a little bit more. There's more than just one plant to go to. So if the environment changes and that plant is no longer there, you know, if you're a specialized moth and that plant no longer exists, good luck. Like, you're not going to live, and your species will likely die off as well if that is the only plant that you can eat from, get nourished by, and also that you are pollinating. That would mean the end of both the plant species and the moth species. But that there are moths and butterflies that are more general moths, meaning they can get their nourishment and they can pollinate lots of different plants and lots of different flowers, and those are the ones that tend to exist the most and exist the longest. And that just because something might be common or something might be general does not necessarily mean that it is low on sort of the evolution totem pole. They actually may be the ones that stick around the longest, which I thought was really interesting. And then he kind of jokingly referred to himself. He said he is a man of many interests, and he worked for years in the wine industry, he mentioned, and then also in an orchid farm, growing orchids, and then he loves entomology and bugs. And he said, you know, it's best in life, his bit of advice was to generalize your knowledge, to learn as much as you can about many different things, because if one industry, you know, dies off, you can have marketable skills in many industries. And so he kind of equated that moth metaphor to our more human condition. So I wanted to pass that tidbit of advice from Paul on to everyone. But I asked him also why people tend to fear moths and love butterflies. Why is it that, you know, we have this positive reaction when we see a butterfly and more of a negative reaction when we see or hear about moths? And he said, you know, there's some folklore that's there. Obviously, there are movies, horror movies or mystery movies like the Mothman prophecies, you know, that depict moths as very frightening, these huge frightening creatures. But that, you know, they also were associated with vermin because they can eat, or their larvae will eat things like flour, right? Or, you know, so we'll get in flour, or because the larvae, the caterpillars, will eat through wool and eat through clothing, whereas butterflies will only, like those caterpillars, only eat plants. They don't really intrude into our human experience and eat things like flour or clothing or the wool. And so that's a big part of it, is because they were kind of equated with different vermin like rodents and others. That's why we tend to have negative associations with moths, even though many of them are as beautiful objectively. If you were to look at, you know, like the yellow emperor that Eleonora prizes in the book Girl of the Limberlost, if you stack that next to a monarch, you know, the yellow emperor is beautiful. You know, it's just as beautiful, if not more beautiful, than the monarch butterfly. But, you know, because it's a moth, it's interesting how often the majority of humans just don't don't like them as well. They're sort of the underdog when it comes to those winged insects. And so that was kind of interesting just to hear him talk a little bit more about like the folklore and kind of the reasons why humans view moths in the way that they do. I guess coming to the end here of our meeting, I've had this renewed interest in nature and really wanting to go out and preserve nature and share some of the wonders of nature with friends and get out and hike more and be in nature more. I was fortunate enough, recently I went to former Vice President Al Gore's training for Climate Reality Leadership Corps, and it was fascinating to see how, fascinating and tragic in many ways, just to see what is happening to our Earth, due to carbon and other, negative impacts that our carbon footprint is having on the ecosystem. And it's given me that coupled with reading books like this one, have really given me this renewed desire to do all that we can, do all within my power as one human being, to be kind to Mother Nature, to be kind to the earth, and to preserve it for generations to come, and to encourage young people and the youth to get out in nature and to see the beauties that exist there, and to do all that we can to preserve those beauties and to not disrupt them. And that's just kind of my hope going forward. And one of my my New Year's resolutions heading into January is to do my best to, continue to make good choices, be a conscious consumer, and do my best to regenerate, restore where I can, to plant some trees, to plant some butterfly bushes, to do what I can to keep, to keep nature as beautiful as it has been for years and years to come. So with that said, I hope you all enjoyed this month's book, Girl of the Limberlost. Again, I recommend the candy cane tea, green tea from Trader Joe's, and this is my mug of my bug mug. I thought it was appropriate for our book club today and for this month. Get excited for next month. We will be reading a graphic novel, so a little bit different from our other books of the year. This graphic novel is March. It's the first book in a series, and it's by John Lewis, Andrew Aiden, and Nate Powell, and it's about Congressman John Lewis, and it's in honor of Martin Luther King Day that's coming up, and so it's about civil rights and Congressman John Lewis's voice in the quest for equality. So I think it will be fascinating. Here's just a little preview of some of the illustrations. It's going to be really interesting to read a graphic novel together, and I'm excited to just hear what your reactions are to it, and hopefully have a bit of a discussion, a nice robust discussion next month about it. So that will be on the last Thursday of January. So I'm excited to see you all then. Please leave questions and comments here on Facebook, on the blog, becomingbohemian.com, through Instagram, whatever platform you like best. Please leave comments, leave questions. If you have questions about the book, I do try to interview one expert, at least one expert, in preparing for our book clubs. So I would love to ask questions that you have, and I'd love to get some interaction with the community, more interaction with the community if possible. So please reach out with any questions you might have this month as you read March, so that I can ask some of our experts that I'll be interviewing about March. Thank you all for joining this evening, and I look forward to next month. Take care. Bye.